Yesterday, Charles warned me that at my age even a small accident could be fatal, and although he tried to sound caring, the words felt like a threat. And Ernest's letter, begging me not to trust anyone blindly, not even our sons, echoed in my mind. Later that night Charles arrived with Jasmine, carrying a bottle of wine and a rehearsed smile, talking about my future. And the $15,000 insurance payout, he somehow already knew the exact amount of, claiming he had helped Ernest with paperwork. A lie. Ernest's note had exposed, and subtly suggesting I move into a retirement home so he and Henry could manage my finances to keep me safe from scams. But their forced sweetness only confirmed their intentions to control, manipulate, and eventually take everything I had left, so I pretended to consider it while rage and fear shook through me. After they left, another message arrived telling me to visit the police station and request the accident report. So the next morning I went to see Sergeant O'Connell, who had known Ernest for years, and when I asked for the report about the machine explosion at the shop, he looked genuinely confused. There was no such report, no explosion, no workplace accident of any kind documented for Ernest. Instead, according to the hospital's medical file the sergeant read from, Ernest had been admitted unconscious with clear symptoms of poisoning, and in that moment the world spun around me as the horrifying truth began to take shape. Poisoning, traces of methanol, enough to cause blindness, brain damage, and eventually death. That's what the doctors had found in Ernest's blood, and hearing Sergeant O'Connell explain that the hospital had been instructed by the immediate family to keep this information confidential because I was supposedly too fragile to handle it made my stomach turn. Because the immediate family who signed those papers were Charles and Henry, the same sons who had lied about an explosion, about a work accident, about everything, and as the truth settled like ice in my chest, that Ernest hadn't died accidentally but had been deliberately poisoned, I listened as the sergeant offered to open an investigation, knowing with absolute certainty now that my own children had murdered their father for money. That afternoon Henry arrived with a bouquet and a saccharine smile, pressuring me about selling the house, inventing excuses about market freshness, liquidity, medical bills, and expenses. But when I quietly told him I knew the truth, that there had been no explosion and no police report, panic flickered across his face before he tried to mask it by accusing me of confusion and grief. He left abruptly after spilling his coffee, whispering in a tense phone call on the porch, and that night my phone lit up again with a chilling message from the unknown sender warning me that tomorrow Charles and Henry would come together to try to convince me I was losing my mind, that my grief was making me imagine things, and I realized they were preparing their final move. The warning in the mysterious message echoed in my mind. Don't believe them and don't take anything they offer. And the next morning it proved true when Charles and Henry arrived together with Jasmine, all of them wearing overly dramatic concern and carrying a bag of pastries they claimed were my favorite. They insisted the neighbors had seen me acting strangely and even lied that Doris said I wasn't eating, then encouraged me repeatedly to try the pastries and coffee they had brought, but I politely refused, remembering exactly what the message had told me. As they sat closer, Charles claimed they had spoken to doctors who believed my recent questions, my visit to the police station, and my focus on details about Ernest's death were signs of emotional confusion common after losing a spouse, even suggesting I might be developing paranoia. I stayed calm and told them clearly I wasn't confused. I was simply asking questions that should have been asked from the very beginning, questions like why there was no police report for the accident they described, why the shop was spotless if a machine had exploded, and why large amounts of money were withdrawn from our account without my knowledge. Their quick exchange of nervous glances told me everything, yet they still tried to cover their tracks with new lies about secret home repairs and surprise renovations Ernest had supposedly planned, explanations that no longer fooled me, not after everything I had already uncovered. When we arrived at the cemetery I was struck by how few people had come. Only Charles, Henry, Jasmine, Doris, the pastor, and me. No co-workers from the shop, no neighbors Ernest had helped for decades, no familiar faces from our small town, just an unsettling emptiness that felt wrong for a man who had lived 70 years serving his community. When I quietly asked Charles why Ernest's colleagues weren't there, he brushed it off, saying he didn't want to bother anyone, and that Dad preferred something intimate. But I knew Ernest would have wanted his community to say goodbye. Throughout the short service, I watched my sons with a disturbing detachment. Charles kept glancing at his watch, Henry looked impatient, and Jasmine hid behind her veil checking her phone, as if they were simply waiting for the inconvenience of grief to end. The pastor's words washed over me without comfort. I didn't want Ernest at peace, I wanted him home, sitting on our porch, drinking coffee with me like always. When it came time to throw dirt on the casket, my legs nearly gave out, and Doris had to hold me upright as I sobbed while the heavy thud of earth striking the wood echoed like a death knell. And then in that exact moment, while my husband's coffin was being swallowed by the grave, my phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number appeared. I'm alive. That's not me in the casket. My blood turned to ice. My hands trembled as I typed, "Who are you?" The response came instantly, "I can't say. They're watching. Don't trust our sons." The phone nearly slipped from my grasp, and when Doris tried to pick it up, I snatched it away, terrified for anyone else to see those words. Charles approached, asking if I was okay, his face arranged in what looked like concern, but now every smile, every gesture, every breath from my sons felt suspicious. "I'm fine," I lied, slipping the phone into my purse, even though nothing in my world was fine anymore. When I left the cemetery, the mysterious messages haunted me. Could Ernest truly be alive, or was someone exploiting my grief? That night, alone in the silent house that felt more like a mausoleum, I replayed every odd detail about Ernest's so-called accident. How Charles claimed a machine had exploded despite Ernest's strict safety habits. How my sons arrived at the hospital before I was even notified, and how quickly they began discussing insurance money. Searching Ernest's desk, I discovered his life insurance had been secretly increased from $5,000 to $50,000 just 6 months earlier, along with a newly purchased workers' comp policy, changes he had never mentioned to me. Another text urged me to check the bank, so the next morning I visited Mrs. Thompson, who showed me statements revealing thousands withdrawn from our savings over the past 3 months. Money I had never touched. When I asked who authorized it, she said Ernest himself had come in person, and the shock of those words sent a cold shiver through me as the mystery deepened. Mrs. Thompson explained that Ernest had claimed he needed the withdrawn money for repairs at the shop, but I managed all household finances and knew we'd never discussed any such expenses, and as I studied the receipts, the shaky signature didn't look like his usual firm handwriting. When I asked whether he'd come alone, she recalled seeing one of my sons, likely Charles, accompanying him under the excuse that Ernest struggled to read documents without his glasses, even though he never removed them. During the day. That afternoon, another message arrived saying the insurance increase had been their idea and that convincing Ernest to upgrade his policies had been a trap. And suddenly the pieces fit together. The secret insurance changes, the unauthorized bank withdrawals, Charles's involvement, his rushed funeral arrangements, and the coldness I'd sensed from both my sons. Still, I needed proof, and the mysterious texter pushed me toward Ernest's shop, claiming there were things I hadn't seen. When I arrived, the shop was spotless, far too clean to have been the site of an explosion, and every machine from the welder to the compressor sat intact and functional. Searching Ernest's desk, I found a chilling note written 3 days before his death, expressing his distrust of Charles's insistence on more insurance and confusion over documents Henry brought him to sign, followed by a second note showing that Ernest sensed something dark brewing. Then I found a sealed envelope with my name on it, containing a letter in Ernest's handwriting warning that if I was reading it, something terrible had likely happened and that he had noticed unsettling changes in Charles and Henry, their growing obsession with money, the insurance policies and pressures, especially from Jasmine, to sell the house. Henry's eyes were red, but something in his expression felt wrong, as if the sadness he wore didn't reach beneath the surface. The audacity of their earlier inheritance request lingered in my mind, but now it mixed with terror, grief, and a creeping dread I didn't yet understand. Ernest remained calm even in crisis, yet I had seen his jaw clench when the boys insisted we were too old to make our own decisions, and now those words echoed in my ears like a warning. That night before the accident, after they left, Ernest had told me something was terribly wrong, that this wasn't just impatience or ambition but something darker. I hadn't wanted to believe it, but standing in that hospital hallway, hearing my sons talk about explosions and machines as if rehearsed, noticing they arrived before I was even contacted, everything inside me began to twist. Charles hugged me tightly, almost too tightly, whispering that Dad was in bad shape, while Henry stood stiffly behind him, avoiding my gaze. Ernest had worked with those machines for 40 years without a single major accident. He inspected everything, maintained every piece with devotion. My heart pounded as the doctors approached with grim faces, and in that moment, something inside me broke open. I felt the first shadow of a truth far too horrifying for a mother to consider. What if Ernest's accident wasn't an accident at all? And what if my own sons had known it was coming? He seemed more nervous than sad, like someone waiting for important news instead of grieving for his father, and when I begged to see Ernest, the nurse allowed only immediate family for 5 minutes at a time. The moment I stepped into the ICU and saw my husband hooked to countless machines, his face wrapped in bandages, his body nearly unrecognizable, my heart shattered. Yet when I held his one uninjured hand, he managed a faint squeeze that told me he was still fighting for me. I spent the next 3 days at the hospital, barely sleeping, while Charles and Henry hovered around the doctors, asking more about costs, insurance and beneficiaries than about Ernest's recovery, with Charles even bringing up the $50,000 life insurance and potential workers' compensation on the second day, as if the numbers mattered more than his dying father. On the third day, Dr. Patterson told us Ernest's burns were infected, his head trauma worsening, and that he was unlikely to ever wake from the induced coma. I begged them to fight for him no matter the cost, but Charles and Henry exchanged a cold look that made my blood freeze before gently insisting we be practical, claiming Dad wouldn't want to be a burden and warning that medical bills would wipe out my savings. Hearing my sons call their father, a man who had sacrificed everything for them, a burden made something inside me break, and as I stared at their calculating expressions, focused more on money than the man who had raised them, I felt a chilling suspicion begin to grow in my heart. That this tragedy might not be a tragedy at all, but something far darker. My husband was dying and they were calculating costs. That night, alone in the dim hospital room, I held Ernest's hand and whispered to him, begging for a miracle, telling him I didn't know how to live without him, and then something happened that still chills my bones. His fingers tightened around mine, faint but deliberate, and his lips moved as if he were desperately trying to speak. I screamed for the nurses, but by the time they arrived he was still again, and they dismissed what I had felt as involuntary spasms, though in my heart I knew Ernest had tried to warn me about something. 2 days later, before dawn on Friday, alarms shrilled through the hallway. Nurses rushed into his room as I ran behind them screaming his name. For 40 agonizing minutes they tried to bring him back, but at 4:37 a.m. my world ended. I clung to his warm body, sobbing uncontrollably, unable to accept that the love of my life was gone. Charles and Henry arrived an hour later, too calm, too prepared, carrying papers, phone numbers and funeral arrangements already planned, even mentioning the insurance claim as if it were just another business transaction. Exhausted by grief, I couldn't fully process the cold efficiency with which they handled their father's death, but something inside me whispered that something was terribly wrong. On Monday, the funeral day, the sky was heavy and gray as if mourning with me. Charles rushed through every detail, choosing the plainest casket and the shortest service without asking my opinion, insisting it was what Dad would have wanted, though I knew Ernest would have deserved so much more than a hurried goodbye. That morning, Doris had to steady my trembling hands to button my old black dress, whispering for me to be strong, but I felt hollow, because after 42 years of love, partnership and memories, I wasn't just burying my husband, I was burying the last piece of the life we had built together. My name is Margot Hayes and I'm 66 years old, and what I'm about to share is the moment that shattered everything I knew about my life. The day of my husband Ernest's funeral was the quietest, heaviest day of my existence, and as I stood beside his grave, surrounded by silence and grief, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number that froze the blood in my veins. I'm alive. That's not me in the casket. My hands trembled as I replied, "Who are you?" And the response was even more horrifying. "I can't say. They're watching. Don't trust our sons." In that instant, my soul split in two, because when I looked at Charles and Henry standing at the casket with strangely calm faces, forced tears and hugs cold as winter wind, I felt something was terribly wrong. For 42 years, Ernest had been my partner, my safe place, the love I found at 24 in the small town of Spring Creek. We grew up on the same dusty back roads, him fixing bicycles in the tiny shop he'd inherited from his father, me cleaning houses to care for my sick mother, and though we were poor, we had a love that felt richer than anything money could give. I'll never forget the first time he spoke to me, stepping out of his shop with grease-stained hands, smiling shyly as he asked if he could check my bike, even though I didn't have one, and I made up an excuse just to stay and talk to him. Those small conversations soon became long afternoons under the old oak tree in Town Square Park, then promises of forever, and eventually a simple wedding stitched together with hope. Our early years were difficult, living in a 2-bedroom house with a tin roof, placing pots around the floor when it rained, but we were still happy, with Ernest working from dawn to dusk while I sewed clothes for the women in town. And when our first son Charles was born, with Ernest's big eyes and my smile, I thought life had finally given me everything I'd ever dreamed of. 2 years later, Henry was born, just as healthy and perfect, and I raised both boys with all the love I had, always putting their needs before mine. Ernest was a caring father who took them fishing on Sundays, taught them practical skills, and filled their childhood with bedtime stories. I cared for them through every meal, every tear, and every moment of growing up, and I truly believed we were a close, happy family. But as the years passed, things slowly changed. Charles, the oldest, became ambitious and often questioned why we lived so simply, and Henry always copied his views. When Charles turned 18, he refused Ernest's offer to work at the shop, saying he wanted a different kind of life, and although Ernest stayed quiet, I could see how deeply it hurt him. Eventually, both boys moved to the city, built successful careers, and earned more money than we ever imagined. At first I felt proud, but that pride slowly shifted into sadness as their visits became rare and their calls rushed. They would show up in fancy clothes, speaking like strangers, and sometimes looking at our simple home with discomfort. Charles once told us we should move somewhere nicer because the house was getting old, but to us that place held every memory that shaped our lives. Ernest would gently say that money had changed them and that we no longer fit into their new world, and even though I tried to deny it, deep down I knew he was right. I kept hoping they'd return to the warm, loving boys we raised, but in my heart I realized we had already lost our sons long before I lost my husband. I just didn't realize how far the distance between us had grown until everything changed even more. The biggest shift happened after Charles married Jasmine Albright, a woman from the city who made no effort to hide how out of place she felt around us. The first time he brought her home, she stepped onto our porch in high heels that sank into the dirt and wore a bright red dress that looked far more expensive than anything I had ever owned. She greeted me with a stiff smile and barely offered the tips of her fingers, her eyes scanning our small home in a way that made me feel judged without a word spoken. At dinner, she barely tasted the food I had prepared with such care, pushing it around her plate while Charles nervously apologized for things he used to be proud of. I overheard him whisper to her about going to a restaurant next time, and each word felt like a quiet rejection of our life. Henry, though unmarried, acted much the same, showing up only for special days, glued to his phone, always rushing off for work and reminding me he had important meetings. Our once warm family gatherings faded into brief, formal visits filled with expensive gifts but little affection. Ernest and I grew older in that quiet house, leaning on each other as our sons drifted further away, even though we never asked them for a thing. One evening, as we shared coffee on the porch, Ernest told me the hardest truth, that it wasn't their success that hurt, but the way it made them believe we no longer mattered. And he was right. What had changed wasn't just their lifestyle but their hearts. We were no longer the parents they once adored, that we had become nothing more than an uncomfortable reminder of the past they wanted to erase. And things only grew worse when Charles bought a $200,000 house in an exclusive neighborhood, followed by Henry purchasing a $150,000 luxury condo, both of them suddenly wealthy in ways Ernest and I could barely fathom. During one visit, Jasmine coolly suggested we sell our home and move into a retirement community, as if 40 years of memories could be traded for convenience. And although Ernest responded with his usual dignity, I saw clearly that both our sons supported the idea. Soon Charles returned with prepared documents insisting our house, worth only $1,000, should be sold so we could move somewhere better, never understanding that no place could replace the home where we had laughed, cried, and built our lives. Their so-called concern extended to urging Ernest to retire from the shop that gave his days purpose, their voices full of a false sweetness masking impatience and some hidden urgency. In the months that followed, their pressure grew unbearable. They brought real estate agents without telling us, had the house appraised behind our backs, and spoke openly about what would be best for everyone. Then Charles crossed a line I never imagined a child of mine would approach. During dinner, he said he and Jasmine were planning to have kids soon and suggested that selling our house could provide them with an early inheritance. An inheritance while we were still alive. At that moment, I realized fully how little we meant to them beyond what we could give.